They may be watching you, but I'm watching them. This is Gabriel Custodiet. Just to let you know that the episode you're about to listen to is going to be great, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. If you're new to privacy or looking for a clear vision of next steps, start by going to escapethetechnocracy.com. All our cutting-edge analysis about escaping the surveillance grid occurs exclusively on our paid newsletter, Watchman's Torch, and in our world-class video tutorials. This podcast is just a preview. This is not some game for us. We live this stuff and we consult on it. Your support means we have no sponsors and can speak the unmitigated truth as we see it on this show. Check out the show notes and escapethetechnocracy.com. I am very pleased today to be joined by Tom Bodrovics. Tom, as I'll read from his website, he's an entrepreneur, he's a podcaster, a welder, a lifelong learner whose diverse experiences have shaped him into a beacon of competence and self-reliance. I first heard Tom through listening to the excellent show Palisades Gold Radio. We're going to talk about that throughout this discussion. And he also released a really excellent podcast called the Competent Man Podcast, and that should be on everybody's radar at this point in time. So, Tom, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm excellent, Gabriel. It's a pleasure to be on your show and to speak with you again.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. I had been listening to Palisades Gold Radio for a while, and we connected years ago over that very thing. I was on that show at one point in time. I don't necessarily highlight that too much because I think that was an early interview for me, so I was probably stumbling all over myself. But I was on that show. It's an excellent show, and let's just kind of start there because that's something you've been doing for the last few years, and I think it's pretty clear that this is really one of the best shows of its kind. When we start talking about, contrary investing and economics and the monetary system, especially from, let's say, an Austrian or a libertarian perspective, like this is the show. And under your guidance, that's grown to 100,000 plus subscribers on YouTube, despite not being in favor of the YouTube algorithm gods, let's just say. So you've done a really impressive job on that and taken people on this really cool journey with some amazing guests. And one thing that I've also learned from you is just how to be a better podcaster in terms of listening to your guests instead of talking over them and being prepared and all the rest. These are things that you're really good at. Let's just start then with Palisades Gold Radio. So you're really great at selecting guests and you have these fantastic people on. If I were to say, like, who are the people that you admire or you follow their work a lot or you enjoy them as guests, who would be a list of like some of the top people that come to mind to give people a sense of who you have on Palisades Gold Radio?
I'd say somebody like Rick Rule. He is so full of wisdom and he's so articulate and has such a way of being able to explain things. I really look up to him just from let's say an intelligence standpoint. Somebody like Doug Casey, for example, as well. These multi-dimensional guests to me are extremely valuable, and I always walk away from a conversation with them with far more wisdom than I felt like I just covered from a, let's say, surface level. I rarely go back, because I do so many of those interviews, I rarely go back and re-listen to them. But let's say top three would be Rick Rule, Doug Casey, Matthew Piepenburg, guys like that are excellent speakers, but also have a wealth of knowledge to share outside of just the financial realm.
Yeah, no, it's really a who's who if you look at the list of guests that you have on, and you're very familiar with them, you're very prepared, you've listened to their work, you've read their books. I can't imagine the kind of education that you yourself have gone on over the last few years. And kind of on that topic, it's called Palisades Gold Radio. It kind of started off as talking about investing in gold companies and the value proposition of gold, but you have taken it in a direction where it's broader investing. You're talking about economics, as I mentioned, monetary system, all sorts of interesting topics. But just maybe starting with gold, because this is, I'm sure you've listened to all the arguments for gold more than just about anybody on earth at this point in the last several years. It's certainly a key theme, right? Gold. After all this research, this dozens of hours of working on this stuff a week, what are your views on gold?
Well, obviously, it's not just a one-dimensional idea. I feel like a broken record always bringing this up, but I love. There was an early guest of the show, and he told me that gold and silver are really a gateway to understanding the world, because many of the topics that we cover on the show aren't initially, let's say, understandably related to gold. We can take the current idea of the conflict in Iran and Israel as an example of that. We cover a lot of geopolitics on the show. We cover a lot of economics on the show. We cover a lot of, let's say, energy markets as well on the show, because all of these things end up being very interrelated, and they all do play a role in the analysis of the financial system, and in a lot of ways the financial insurance that metals play within that ecosystem. So I think actually a better way to understand it for myself has been to actually be a part of those markets and having been invested in those particular markets and watching that real-time return or adjustment for inflation, whatever you want to call that, of actually owning the metals and seeing people's reaction to that. You know, I've been invested in metals for far longer than I've been a host of the show. Obviously, that has provided me with a lot more of a concrete example. So the way that I think about it is, in a lot of ways, bullion to me is almost equivalent to cash with a far better return than cash. But I also look at it as a holy shit type bank account that I don't want to have to tap into, but I have the optionality to be able to tap into. The other part of it to me that really appeals to me is the idea that it is a tangible asset that I can put in my safe, in a bullion account. I can put it in a different sovereign country. I can put an actual tangible asset that over time does reflect inflation. Obviously, it's not perfect, but this asset also can't just be taken from me by a hacker or an EMP glitch, anything like that, because it is a physical asset. That might sound like, to me, it is the end all be all, and I do not see it that way either. I think there's many ways and reasons to diversify within the financial world, whether that is banking, which I know we're going to get into, whether it is metals, whether it is any type of these different asset classes. One of the ways that I've kind of crystallized and explained this to people over the last couple of years that I've come up with is that since, let's say, 2008, with governments printing so much currency, and I use that word very deliberately, there's a big difference between currency and money. Printing so much currency, they're basically spraying all of this currency into the world, and we need different buckets to be able to catch some of it and have the ability to raise our own boat, float our own boat. That once you understand what the monetary system is all about, being able to get outside of that and not only being harnessed to that is something that is really important to me, and a big role that gold, especially, not so much silver in my mind, is very good at.
On the show, you talk about a lot of the big issues and the geopolitics and the philosophical stuff, and you also have people on. You get really into the weeds of some of the details about particular gold companies and the different manifestations of it, whether that's mining companies, physical gold itself. You know, what's something like when you own a company like Sprott, what exactly is the value of something like that? So you really get into a lot of the specifics as well as the general stuff, which is why a lot of people love the versatility of your show. And you bring up a great point that gold isn't, it's not that gold itself is doing anything like improving on a daily basis. It's really what else is happening in the world and what governments are doing that gives gold its value at any given point in time. And so gold really opens the door to understanding, the currency printing and the geopolitics and some of the other stuff that's going on. And I don't know if you would use this term. I know some people don't like it, but I guess one way of describing your show is that you talk about a lot of maybe contrarian investing, where it's not just, talking about the latest tech stock or something, but it's looking at maybe precious metals or uranium and what kind of global politics might change the value proposition of those. How would you describe maybe this kind of contrarian investing mindset? How is it different to the status quo? And maybe what are some of the key lessons that you've learned over the years about being an investor and thinking against the grain?
Well, you kind of touched upon an interesting idea there, that it isn't necessarily gold going up, but it's actually the dollar going down as a measuring stick against the value of gold. These are themes that I look at, and I think it's very important to look at over a far longer timeline than the next week, the next month. Again, being part of or having capital invested in precious metals for over a decade now, that is a really important way and way of learning of how money and currency actually works, and what that return looks like over time. So the idea of contrarian investing, to me, we have to separate the idea behind, let's say, the fundamentals of an argument or a market or an asset class versus what ends up being the catalyst for it to actually move. So for example, let's take the past 2 years for the gold market. It's gone from $1,600 in, let's just use a round number, for in the last 2 years, it's basically doubled. It's been one of the best performing asset classes, and that's the useless rock that can sit in your safe or wherever you choose to keep it, that has now literally doubled. It's outperformed the S&P minus dividend rebalancing. It's outperformed many of these different asset classes. So for me, the idea of contrarian investing also is very focused on a longer timeline, because really the idea of the Fed and many of these different central banks around the world printing so much currency, this has driven everybody up the risk ladder, because we're constantly searching for yield in a world that has had interest rates go basically since 1980 nowhere but down until, let's say, 4 years ago. So this is a dramatic shift within these financial markets that has now come to the fore and has really changed. So again, over the last, let's say, 2 years, most of the central banks have been, at least they've hiked rates after the pandemic, and now they're back into a place where many of the central banks in the world, minus the US, is back to cutting. And it looks very likely to me within the next 18 months that we're going to be going back to the US also cutting, very likely, and going back to stimulating. In that type of environment, that's actually a very different driver for precious metals prices, because what is looked at mainly for the rise of the gold price over the last 2 years was mainly central bank buying by big entities like China, many of these Eastern central banks, to increase the size of a riskless an asset that has less counterparty risk than, let's say, US treasuries, for example. So to me, this becomes a new driver, or a new possible catalyst for the gold price to continue higher. Obviously, that's not ever guaranteed, but when we look at equation of paying interest on our interest in many of these very highly indebted countries around the world, this is an equation that only progresses in one way. And again, the idea, especially for me, of being a student of these markets and of these types of financial systems for so many years, this idea of looking at this over a far longer and broader timeline, it's tying back that idea in of being driven up the risk ladder. The higher the risk, the higher possible reward in a lot of these things, let's say like Nvidia or these shiny tech stocks. But when that rotation happens, you can lose your ass on a lot of this stuff. I mean, any of these meme coins or shit coins over the last, let's say 8 years is a perfect example of that. There's so many of these different cryptocurrencies. And I mean, there's a lot of people that separate Bitcoin away from that ecosystem. So being deliberate about that, that difference there. But there's so many of those examples where people either made a lot of money or lost a lot of money. And unless you're all in on having some type of informational advantage there, you don't necessarily have the ability to outsmart a lot of those markets. So again, to me, creating wealth and trying to account for this constant printing, looking at that over that longer term time frame, understanding the low risk type of growth that you're going to get there is very important to understanding that thesis for the precious metals. The idea that making $1 million tomorrow because of one particular investment that you made, if there's one thing that I've learned through my life, it's that nothing worth having comes from an easy, quick get rich scheme or an easy, quick way to learn a skill or make a buck. The most valuable and best returns come from being patient, understanding the thesis to the best of your ability, constantly learning about it, and putting the work in over time. Kind of that idea of 10,000 hours, rather than these get rich quick schemes.
I mean, that's obviously good thinking right there. I guess I'll say at this point, like we're not talking about any investing advice or financial advice or anything like that on this show, as everybody knows. I wanted to pick your brain, Tom. Part of contrary investing, part of the, let's say, the Austrian economics vision of investing is to understand what has become known as modern monetary theory. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, and let me explain this from whether or not you have a new appreciation for modern monetary theory. So bear with me for a moment. So when we talk about modern monetary theory, right, whole category of stupidities, basically, we're talking about printing currency with near reckless abandon. Sometimes we're talking about becoming indebted by having welfare and warfare states and not being able to pay for it with taxes. So you become indebted and just kind of do these weird borrowing more money to pay off the previous debt and all this kind of stuff, having central banks manipulate interest rates to play with human incentives. And yet, Tom, I've come to realize over time that if I'm 100% certain that the plane cannot function any longer and it's going down, then maybe I want the MMT guy as the pilot at the helm. And the reason is I'm going to have a good time. It's going to slow down that inevitable crash so much that at moments I won't even believe that we're crashing. And this is like modern monetary theory. It's ridiculous. It doesn't work in the long run, but it certainly has really slowed down what a lot of people think should have been a crash a long time ago. And it's really kicked this can down the road with some supreme professionalism, I have to say. Do you have any appreciation for modern monetary theory as you've thought about it over the years?
Absolutely. I mean, I've struggled with the idea that for some reason countries don't operate like households. I was raised with a grand aversion for debt, for owing anybody money, anything like that. And I've spent some time actually traveling across Africa by motorcycle with Francis Hunt, for example. And him and I both agreed that our aversion to having debt probably put us behind a lot of other people that used debt far more strategically when interest rates were quite low. So, there's always a tension between the way you see the world and somebody else's different framework through which they can objectively be quote unquote more successful over a period of time. So the idea that I come back to with this modern monetary theory idea, number one, I think that the free market that we do not currently have is probably the best force for good within the world. And we need, and I say need underlined and bolded and with all of the highlighters possible, really emphasizing the idea of need corrections within these markets. The idea that we basically have not had a recession since 2008, and we've blown up all of these. This is now called the everything bubble. We have bubbles in the housing markets, in the asset based market, like in the equity markets. Basically, everywhere you look, things seem far more toppy and overvalued than they otherwise should be or would have been in a normal market without the idea of money printing. This also brings me back to the idea that we are only borrowing from tomorrow. We have, as you said, kicked this can so far down the road that each American, I think, based on the debt clock, each American owes something like between $200,000 and $300,000 worth of debt, and that's just based on the national debt rather than even the implied social programs that are outlaid for this type of spending. So the idea that the US, for example, owes, quote unquote, owes something like $37 trillion worth of debt. We throw $1 trillion around like it's nothing. We don't necessarily stop to think about it. And again, a previous guest of the show really crystallized this for me. And he said, do you know how big $1 trillion actually is? One of the best ways to conceptualize this is to understand that $1 trillion is equivalent to spending $1 per second for the last 31,710 years. It's something around that. I'll repeat that. You would have had to spend $1 per second for the last 31,710 years. Don't quote me on that exact number. That's just the one off the top of my head. Yeah, it's a mind-blowing amount of currency, right? And that doesn't include forward Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of that other stuff. It doesn't include all of the derivatives based on the financial markets. Like that's a small snapshot of what the world, quote unquote, owes, or the US owes itself and the rest of the world that buys this debt. So at some point, there is going to be a reckoning for this. I don't subscribe to the idea that it's going to happen tomorrow. I don't subscribe to the idea that we should be paying attention to all of this doom and gloom. I'm very deliberate about staying away from particular people that are just super doom and gloom on the show, because I don't think that's a valuable way to deliver information to base big financial decisions upon. I think we need to be as sober as possible, as honest as possible, and deliver that message, basically temper that message for what the actual risks are. I 100% thought when I started learning about this stuff seriously in 2013 that a real financial crash and day of reckoning was only, let's say, maybe 2 years away. So we're now 10 years past that particular deadline that I had heard so much about over and over and over. And while I do recognize the possibility for that, I think any of us within this community that started learning about that we're surprised at how far this can has been able to be kicked down the road. Again, we're borrowing from tomorrow to feed today. Now, going back to this idea of, let's say, the value of MMT, it's hard to argue against the amount of growth and the amount of quote unquote poverty that this has pulled people out of. You look at our world today, and it's incredible the amount of luxuries that much of the first world enjoys. But this also, to me, is this actually ends up destroying the morality of a society. When you don't have a good way of reinforcing the value of hard work, the value of capital, the value of the currency, this ends up being corrosive to society. And one of the good examples that I recently talked about on stage at the Cornerstone conference on a sound money panel was this idea of simply a teenager with a car. I was raised with the idea that you basically pay cash for everything you have, and you work your ass off to get that cash. You don't take a loan or go into debt for anything that is not absolutely essential. Obviously, maybe housing can be put in an essential category, and I made some pretty good returns on a house. I bought my first house when I was 19 years old. Again, the idea of using debt strategically and understanding debt cycles, I think is quite important. I'm not saying that this is a complete no-no to use debt, but thinking about it more strategically is extremely important to me. So again, going back to this example, if you look at a teenager with a vehicle that they work their ass off for, that they grinded at some shitty job at KFC, for example, like I did, to buy my first vehicle, you really value that vehicle and you want to take care of it because you know the amount of work that it took in order to purchase that vehicle in the first place. And you treat it completely differently than friends of mine who had their motorcycles or their primary vehicles bought for them, or a vehicle that they got brand new with a 0% interest rate. They value that piece of equipment completely differently when you understand the value of work and sacrifice that goes into making a big purchase like that. And as a society, I think we've lost a lot of that. We've taken a lot of that for granted, and that to me does not. The debt system ends up being a corrosive part on, let's say, the morality of a society when things are just too easy and too simple.
You got really deep there. I think that's an excellent point, though, about how obviously these economics can alter our moral principles and weaken our resolve and all these other sorts of things.
Well, to me, it all comes back to incentives, right? Incentives are everything. Show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. This is another example of why money and currency and, gold and silver, whatever you want to call it, is really tied into everything.
Take a sidestep here. Although it's along similar lines, you are Canadian, and we are often talking about the economic chaos in the United States. However, as you're well aware, things are just as bad and in some cases worse in Canada. I wonder if you could describe maybe some, maybe in the context of the U.S. as kind of the comparison, what some of the economic chaos is that you see happening in Canada.
There are some obviously important differences. The idea that Canada sold all of their gold at rock bottom prices, there's all kinds of theories about why and who was behind that and what the incentives were behind that. Canada holds no gold as an asset versus basically every other country in the world holding gold, or their central bank holding gold, which we can obviously debate the idea of and the benefits or downfall of. But I don't know off the top of my head what the, let's say, per capita debt would be in Canada versus the US. But again, this is a situation to me that only progresses in one direction. The idea that we're constantly enlarging deficits just to pay the interest on our debt is like paying a credit card off with another credit card. At some point, the shit is going to hit the fan on this. This equation only progresses in one way. And being able to diversify out of a currency that has continuously lost value against gold and against the US dollar and against many other currencies, seeing that chart over time is extremely instructive to me. Taking the in a lot of ways the now shame to me of being Canadian aside, this is a country that I have now basically I've crystallized the through the saying of this is now the age of unaccountability. We have a quote unquote charter of rights that has been infringed upon. We have a financial system that is completely indebted and only getting worse every day through giving, for example, recently announced at the G7, which was held only an hour from where I am currently, it was announced that we're giving the Ukraine another $8 billion when we have plenty of problems domestically. We've brought in hundreds of thousands of low-skilled immigrants that are only adding to the burden of the social safety net. Some of these individual immigrants are getting over $100,000 a year in government benefits for the particular first year that they're here, for example.
That sounded crazy until I realized that was probably Canadian dollars.
As a friend of mine calls it, Canadian pesos. or maybe we should be calling them Canadian rupees. But again, the incentive structure. What is the incentive structure for me as a natural born Canadian that works my ass off and pays all of these taxes to a government that is completely misaligned with my values and spends this money on, or currency, pardon me, on so much bullshit and frivolous garbage versus somebody that comes here and just because they are from a different country and have a different, let's say, socioeconomic status or skin color or however you want to categorize them, they have the ability to show up and be given a higher standard of living than many Canadians that are just grinding themselves to death. That to me is a system that is A, broken, and B, absolutely unsustainable. The idea of demographics and growing through immigration, those are important ideas. Those are important contributors to GDP. Those are important contributors to growth if done properly. But when we have the ability to just turn on the money printer or whoever falls asleep on the zero key and just keeps adding zeros on their keyboard, this again comes back to a question of the erosion of the morality of a society. And having the ability to opt out of that as much as I can is something that is quite important to me. I don't think that the Canadian pension program, for example, is something that is going to have the ability for me to be, once I am of age, I don't think that program is going to exist at that point. So why would I pay into that? That's just ludicrous to me.
This will get us into maybe some interesting questions about the benefits and downsides of things like tariffs, etc. Why is it impossible to find carry gold butter in Canada at certain times of the year? And what does that teach us about economics and incentives and tariffs?
Well, I actually brought this up on an interview yesterday for the Palisades channel. This very example. So Canada has something like a 400% tariff on any dairy product that is brought in from outside the country. This is protectionism. This is a direct threat, let's say, to the free market, because if you have a product that is better and you can get it here for a reasonable price and the market demands it, you should be able to sell that butter or whatever good it's going to be, even service, to anybody that wants it within the world, that values it. So because the Canadian dairy lobby was so effective whenever they instituted this particular tariff, we now have this 400% surcharge or tax in place, and you basically can't get grass-fed butter in Canada because Canadian weather basically dictates that you can't feed cows on grass for 12 months of the year. So they're getting some type of stored food that is not as nutritionally dense or nutritionally positive, let's just call it, for the cows. However you want to value this particular good, that being grass-fed butter. So because we have a 400% tariff, you can't get that type of butter from a different country because it's just prohibitively expensive to basically bring in as an importer or a retailer of that type of butter. So the idea that tariffs are net positive is missing the point. The idea that tariffs are a net negative is also missing the point. It's a tax that drives behavior, and that is a direct, to me, it is a direct threat to a free market system. I don't know if I particularly answered your question.
It is ironic how Canada will gladly let in just huge, ungodly amounts of non-Canadians into the country and not really protect the local population, while at the same time they're really worried about the dairy industry and protecting that part of Canada.
I'm not saying that all immigration is bad either, right? Like, I definitely see this demographics problem, and this is something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily take into account. But if your population isn't growing at a at least replacement rate, your country is basically screwed. I think the idea of incentivizing high skilled people that have put a lot of work into an education or a particular skill, I think that is an absolute good for society. I don't think that being completely isolationist and locking your borders down is the solution to this. I also don't think that letting anybody in, regardless of criminal background, lack of skills, ability to provide a net positive to society, or ability to feed themselves, that overall equation needs to be looked at honestly rather than just this feel good way of basically handing our country over and our currency over and our standard of living over to anybody and everybody that doesn't share the same values of our society, and that being, let's say, ability to contribute to this particular society and enrich this particular society from many different ways, many different aspects.
You talk about all sorts of things on your show. One of the big contrarian investment ideas for the last stretch of time, honestly, has been uranium. What's the bull argument for uranium, and where do you think things are going with that market?
This is, again, a particular, let's just call it an asset or asset class, that has a fundamental picture that is far more bullish than the micro or short-term return might suggest. So, for example, a friend of mine who I've actually spent some time with, Justin Hune, he calls himself the Uranium Insider. I spoke to him recently, and we went over the idea that going into especially the early 2030s, that the supply versus demand picture for uranium in the world, that gap is only widening. The idea that nuclear power is scary and threatening has been disproven time after time, despite all of the interests aligned against the nuclear industry. And this is something that didn't really occur to me, that the oil lobby, for example, again, there's all these lobbies that have so much power within the world, within the political system. Their incentives are aligned directly against, let's say, the uranium industry. So there's smear campaigns that have actually been proven to be launched and financed by, let's say, particularly the oil industry, as counterintuitive as that might seem initially. But nuclear power is one of the safest ways of generating power. It has resulted in the fewest amount of deaths per gigawatt supplied to the market. It is extremely clean when done right. And the idea that we're still on V4, V5 of many of these reactor systems is ludicrous to me. If we can look at this particular way of generating clean electricity that is essential to growth and essential now to modern life, we should be able to be looking at all of these different systems objectively. So again, the idea that this supply/demand gap is only widening, especially out into the early 2030s. This gives you the ability, again, over a decent timeline that is not tomorrow, to be investing in companies that have on their books the ability to produce uranium for the market that is going to be essential and only growing into the future. And the idea that we're only, as a society, demanding more and more and more power, especially with the growth of AI and these gigantic data centers. This is an equation that only grows in one direction. And if you want to kind of crystallize this further, the ability or the growth of a society, the growth of GDP, is directly tied to the amount of energy that country has the ability to provide its entire system or citizens or industrial base with. And so, again, the fundamentals are only looking better and better and better for this particular asset class. It is a safe asset class. And we need to change a lot of our negative thinking around that way of generating power, because much of it has been co-opted by, unfortunately, incentives that were aligned against it, threatened by it.
Well, that let's wrap up then that particular part of your life, the Palisades Gold Radio life, and move on to some other interesting parts of who you are. But maybe just one adjacent question to this: as a really impressive podcast host who is just relentless at getting good guests and just a machine when it comes to cranking out high quality stuff, you have had some experiences in some form or another with shadow banning for your topics. Just what have you learned about shadow banning and the way that these big tech platforms treat the things you talk about? Any kind of insights?
I wish that we were able, as a society, in some ways, to understand many of the problems we're facing from a similar viewpoint. And this is not me saying that I don't value other viewpoints, but when we have a massive platform like, for example, YouTube, that is in a lot of ways, the only game in town for a lot of people. That's the way that the network effect that YouTube has built is amazing. But when it's being run by people that have a particular viewpoint and are imposing a particular set of rules on all of the content creators and have the ability to stifle free speech or any idea, really, again, this kind of comes back to the idea of the free markets. We should be able to be letting the best and freest company or content platform be able to win within that market. I don't think a lot of people realize the degree to which YouTube incentive or rewards particular channels for sticking to their set of rules. I had an experience where I had an interview with a particular guest, and 8 words out of an 80-minute interview got that interview taken off of our platform. I had to go through a re-education campaign about the magic juice and how basically anything that could possibly be positive for the idea of resistance to getting the magic juice, they do not allow any of that on their.
Hey, I took that re-education seminar as well. We got something in common.
And it's incredible to actually see the questions. You get a set of questions that you have to answer properly to, and it's just the most Orwellian set of questions and kind of re-education campaign. To me, as somebody that studies these types of systems and these types of control systems, especially, it's just incredible to me. But that being aside, I wish that the market could understand the degree to which, let's say, free speech is throttled and must adhere to the ideologies of the, let's just say for the moment it's left leaning, but this problem exists on both sides, or any particular side that you're taking. You never want to give power to the other side, because if your team has that power now, at some point in the future, the other team that you don't necessarily identify with is going to have that power and abuse it as well against you, possibly. So that's an important thing for me to keep in mind. So again, the idea of censorship from YouTube, I wish that we could have something like Rumble or Substack or whatever it's going to be grow to actually become a real threat against YouTube, because we don't have the ability to have an open and honest argument and let the best ideas win within that ecosystem or that platform.
Moving on to another interesting part of your life, you are a welder. I think you maybe still do some of it on certain occasions, but you are a welder, and a very good one, is my understanding. Now, welding is not something that maybe people think very often about, but obviously it's a really important craft, and it's what, you have 2 pieces of metal and they need to connect in some way. Welding is kind of what holds together all of our architecture and machinery and all the rest when it comes down to it. I wonder if you could just paint a picture of just how complex a craft that welding is.
Well, I think you can apply this idea, let's say, to many other systems or other realms other than welding, but you can take any idea or trade or craft and you can do it to the easy level, or you can go to the nth degree. And when I was a younger man, I had this drive to be the best possible welder, to literally a silly way to say it maybe is the what I ended up calling my company was Ruthless Industries, because I was absolutely ruthless about becoming the best possible welder that I could be. I wasn't there to make friends. I wasn't there to lollygag. I wanted to become the best. And the idea of taking welding to the nth degree and taking as much pride as you possibly can and learning as much as you possibly can about any craft that you're interested in or involved in is something that is extremely important to me. You know, I took let's say the system of learning and the system of my passion that I have as a person and applied it to a realm that I have no formal education in, and that's the world of finance and podcasting and communicating. I I love the idea of just calling myself a dumb welder because I like the idea of being, let's say, underestimated. But again, it's more of a realm or an idea, a way of thinking rather than a way of thinking and applying yourself rather than just the idea of welding. You can do it again to the easy level or to the absolute hardest level possible. So you could just, as easy as it is, pull your trigger and stick two pieces of metal together. And I've known plenty of people that have spent their life or their career doing that base level. Or you can go to the degree that I did, which was, for example, having, let's say, 30 or 40 different qualifications, all of which expire every 2 years. So to amass that amount of different qualifications, you have to constantly be learning, constantly be expanding your horizons, constantly be learning new processes, new ways of doing this particular task. And that expansion of knowledge, that is expansion of skill set is extremely valuable to me, and I think as well in a broader sense to society in general. I made it to a point where there wasn't a whole lot left to learn within the welding industry. I had some excellent people teach me along the way. You know, I have a friend that now lives in the US. He was absolutely obsessed with welding, and that's literally almost all his life consisted of. And he made me feel inadequate in my skill level and my talent level at multiple times through our careers, because we ended up becoming good friends because of this similar way of looking at building our skill sets and expanding our horizons. And that to me is also interesting, because as skilled and as impressive and unbelievably talented and hardworking as this guy was, I still had the ability to help him in to point out to him different ideas of what maybe he was doing that wasn't working. And we really worked synergistically because of my ability to understand things that he wasn't as exposed to, and vice versa. Yeah, I mean, again, you can take it from the let's say the base level of what you would call a MIG welder, where you just have a trigger. You have two leads that come out of your machine. You have a ground and you have your gun, and you just pull the trigger. And as long as your machine is set to a reasonably acceptable parameter, you're sticking two pieces of metal together. I've done everything from that to the most complex and highly skilled level of welding, where to me that's TIG welding, or tungsten inert gas welding, where you're using each of your hands for different tasks, and you're actually using both of your feet for different tasks as well. So, for example, you're applying the heat with one of your hands, you're feeding metal and pulling the metal away with your other hand, while using one of your feet to turn, let's say, the particular piece of pipe that you're working on. So the pedal, one pedal can control the position of that piece of pipe, and you have a machine that rolls it for you so you can continuously weld. And you can even take it to the nth degree, where you're using, again, both of your feet and both of your hands for different tasks, and your other foot is actually controlling the actual amount of amperage that is going into that or through that gun or torch or whatever you're using. So the idea that I had such a wide-ranging career was super interesting. And, I look back at it with, I look back at it very fondly. It wasn't always fun. It wasn't always cool or interesting, but there were cool parts of it. So, I welded everything from small pipelines that capture natural gas and or oil from individual pump jacks. So you're tying in these individual pump jacks and you're welding in a ditch, in a snowstorm or a rainstorm. You're laying in the mud. I have pictures of all of this stuff where you're literally, half your head is in the mud because the water level has come up high enough that it's basically, inches from the bottom of the pipe. And at the end of that job, you take your coveralls to the car wash because, you're going to, there's not even a point to putting your coveralls in a wash machine at that point. I've welded things like gigantic, in a lot of respects, gigantic pieces of pipe that each fitting weighs anywhere from 3 to 10,000 pounds, and that's just an end that you're putting onto a piece of pipe. This pipe is 48 inches in diameter. You can easily just kind of like bend over and walk through this piece of pipe, and it's well over an inch thick. That particular job, we had two ways of doing it. We had the trigger gun, you're just pulling the trigger on your gun way of doing it, and that would take 8+ hours without basically a break of sitting there and just pouring metal into that particular joint. And the other crazy part of that is the heat, the particular process of welding that piece of pipe, because it's a higher carbon content. You need to have a minimum and a maximum parameter of temperature that you're welding that at. So you can't let it cool too fast. You can't let it get too cold, and you also can't let it get too hot. So when you're standing beside this super heavy, gigantic piece of pipe for hours on end, pouring this metal into it, you have a torch underneath you, like a propane torch, that's keeping it within that temperature window. You're literally just baking all day because of the heat, the radiant heat that is coming off of that joint. And then again, going to the really, really, really high end of that stuff, and think about sitting or standing, in one particular position, holding up a weight for, let's say, 8+ hours a day. The repetitive nature of that particular position it's very physically demanding. So then going to the, let's say, the most technical degree, where you're welding something like titanium or duplex or stainless steel. These are very, very technical joints to prepare to be working on. This is very, very high dollar, very rare material in a lot of cases. You can have a small piece that's the size of a dinner plate that's worth $8,000 to $10,000. They're not going to give that little piece to any idiot to just mess up. There's very, very tight tolerances, parameters, cleaning oxides between every single pass. You have to really understand what you're doing, why you're getting the, let's say, the output or the result that you are. If you haven't cleaned everything properly, if you haven't built a proper internal atmosphere that might be leaking just the smallest amount of oxygen that the metal and the oxides are reacting with. It's just such a complex problem with so many variables that can be absolutely sewered by something as small as just a tiny little pin-sized leak in one of your hoses, or one of your, we would call them dams, that you would put inside the pipe to create that internal atmosphere. that excludes oxygen, because oxygen is a reactive gas versus argon being an inert gas. So, I mean, again, we can take this as far down the rabbit hole as you want and talk about the differences between austenitic and martensitic stainless steels and talk about the metallurgy of all of this stuff. But those are three good examples, I think, of the differences between just a small fraction of the jobs that I had the privilege of applying my passion and my skill to.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. Just give people a taste of some of the complexity about something that most people are never really going to think about in their lives. And that's kind of a common theme. It seems when I hear you talk is that you've taken a path that and you talk about things that not a lot of other people in their normie lives are really considering, right? Whether that's the precious metals, being a podcast host, getting into welding. And I think this gets then to your new show, the Competent Man podcast, which I'd encourage everybody to listen to, where you basically have this definition of what a competent man is, and you bring these men on your show and talk about, basically how they got to where they are and some of the ideas surrounding their lives. And maybe I could ask this question, Tom, for maybe there's a 16-year-old boy who's listening right now, and they live in a feminized society. They live in a society that's never really going to tell them about welding or contrarian investing or things of this sort. What are the things that you think that they might miss in terms of becoming competent?
There's a couple thoughts that come to mind as I want to explain that really it is a complex idea. I think one of them is understanding what gives you passion and energy. So for me, I've never looked at myself as somebody that is let's say a welder or a podcaster or whatever it is. I kind of joke with friends that I have similar experiences to, and I say, what brand of ADD did you get? What flavor of ADD did you get? For myself, I've never followed the normal path, let's say, that most people have. I've always followed things that give me passion and energy, because that to me is the key to learning the way that I do. And I think that's the key for most people, to be able to be excited and really apply themselves to the nth degree to any subject under the sun. And that is very much, for me, a big part of being competent, and what I want to kind of highlight on the show of the competent man. That idea of being able to apply, let's say, a system of learning, understanding the way you learn, and having the passion to apply yourself fully to whatever subject it's going to be is the best possible way to explore any idea in the world. And subsequent to that, I also think a lot about the idea of building resilience. You bring up this idea of being raised in a feminized society. I see it all around me when I'm exposed to just younger people these days. Really, anybody around me. I won't even say necessarily only younger people, but we have this society that gives us the ability to be as lazy as we want, to not apply ourselves fully to anything. We have a million distractions of social media and all this other BS that is all, 99% of it is garbage entertainment that is meant to distract you. So being conscious of those distractions, that's one of the keys, and staying out of that trap. Number two, building resilience and understanding that confidence comes from building skills in any facet that you're going to get good at, whether that's motorcycle racing, welding, podcasting, being a chicken cook at a fast food restaurant, whatever it is. As you become more capable, that builds confidence, and that ends up feeding on itself. And like I said at the start, being able to follow ideas or subjects that you are passionate about is a big key in my way of thinking, is the key to building confidence, building skill, building competence generally.
I think that people should definitely be checking out the Competent Man podcast, and you're going to learn a whole lot from these very interesting gentlemen who are on that show and who you talk to at length, who are coming from all sorts of interesting backgrounds.
The idea of the Competent Man came because I have experience and I have applied myself to so many different tasks or passions in my life. I came out of high school, I did my first year of engineering, hated it, went into welding, just fell into welding. I have now kind of replaced welding with podcasting and learning about the world of finance. I got that education through my earbuds as I was welding for 10 plus hours a day for months upon years. And I had the luxury to be able to have earbuds in instead of just earplugs. And that's how I got my education in many of these different topics. And then behind all of this, I've also come to the place where I'm now racing in the pro level of motorcycle racing. I work on all of my own stuff. I'm very mechanical. I can apply myself to having a high level conversation about finance. There's just so many different facets of life that interest me. And that's really what I'm trying to showcase on the show, is to learn all kinds of different ideas from all kinds of different people. In the first 5 episodes of the show so far, I've spoken to a religious scholar that has studied the idea of end times and why he thinks that Trump, for example, is the decoy false messiah within this larger framework of understanding the world through religious study, all the way to a pro motocross racer that bought a plane as an offset to paying taxes. He was winning championships before I was even born. And we moved past that realm to the idea of consciousness, purpose, and reality with Drew Weatherhead, for example. So again, what I want to expose people to is a wide variety of interesting topics and the ability to, let's say, learn lessons through stories.
People should definitely go check that out. Go subscribe. Go support Tom. And if you're a Palisades Gold Radio listener, definitely give him a follow on this new venture that he's on. And Tom, we mentioned that we're going to talk about banks. I just have one question for you regarding banks. You brought to my attention the fact that, and you know this as well as anybody, that a big problem with the financial system is these big banks and fractional reserve banking and how vulnerable they are and all this sort of thing. When you're going to find a bank that you want to trust your hard-earned money to, and even for the people who are trying to go bankless, I know some of these people, you still need a bank at the end of the day. When you're trying to vet a bank, what's the process? What's the ideal process in terms of you do your research, you go to the bank, is it a big bank? Is it a small bank? What are the sorts of questions you should be asking when you trust your hard-earned money to a bank, and who are the people that you should be talking to at that bank?
This applies differently, obviously, to different countries. There's different legal framework that banks have to adhere to. Just the difference between Canadian banks and US banks is massive. But I think there's a couple key points that you should be thinking about. I personally don't really like to keep more than, let's say, $10,000 in any bank, because at the end of the day, this is a counterparty that you are trusting with your hard-earned capital. And if they don't value it the way that you do, which nobody values your stuff the way that you do, you should take every step possible to protect yourself. So personally, I don't keep more than $10,000 in any particular bank. I have basically, the way that I run my system is that I have 2 banks that I deal with. One is a big bank that gives me the ability to basically facilitate any of my requests that a small credit union type bank in Canada. That's what these smaller types of banks are called. They might not have the resources to have the availability of some of the same systems, let's say. So a couple of the ideas that you want to be looking into is, let's say, looking at the statement of financial condition. That's an FDIC requirement in the States. If it's a public bank, you want to look at their proxy statement, their balance sheet, their income statement, and you basically want to understand how well capitalized is this bank. What are their reserve levels? We all should know that banks aren't required to keep 100% cash on hand or even reserves on hand for all of the deposits that they have the liability of, basically. So if me and you each put $100 in the bank, most of these banks are only required to keep something like $2 of actual assets on hand to back that $200. So if you and I both go to the bank and ask to withdraw our $200, we're both getting screwed. So, we know this idea of, or the situation with the Canadian trucker protests where people's bank accounts were frozen. If you went into that understanding that is a possibility, that some type of capital control could be forced upon you, then having some cash, understanding the value of cash or precious metals, or being able to transact in Bitcoin, or having a second bank account with a completely different financial institution, all of those things are extremely valuable. We saw in the banking crisis, I think it was at the beginning of 23, where we saw those 3 regional banks within the US go down. The deposits that they had on hand, some of them were over $1 billion in cash, but the FDIC only insures those each account for $250,000. Not that I want to ever have to rely on the FDIC to replace my currency in an account. Again, this idea of taking personal responsibility for this stuff, I think is extremely important. So the other problem that they had was a duration mismatch with the asset side of their balance sheet versus the liability side of the balance sheet. All you really need to understand with that is that you want a bank that is well capitalized and that understands the value of treating customers properly and having the assets to back the liability, which is your quote unquote savings, or however you want to view that. And the other, let's say, another good tongue-in-cheek example is the ability of the CEO to at least complete 20 push-ups. The reason I say that is because I spoke recently again at that Cornerstone Forum, and as part of my speech, that is inspiring action and our ability to not get stuck down rabbit holes. I said, one example a day, or one example is the ability, if you want to do, let's say, 100 push-ups a day, you break that down into 10 sets of 10. I mean, we can find 15 seconds in multiple parts of our day to just crush out 10 push-ups. And just before, as the CEO of one of the banks that I deal with, as he was being introduced for his talk, which was right after mine, he came up on stage and did a bunch of push-ups. So that was quite a good laugh that we all got out of that.
I like the idea, though, of knowing your banker and vetting them in some way. Most people just think any bank is just like the other. And I also like the idea of just not keeping most of your wealth in a bank. Also appreciate that thought. Now, one of the things that you're doing, one of your new adventures, Tom, is to kind of travel around with a trailer that is self-sufficient. And you are, in my understanding, you are self-sufficient in most things, including your power generation. What did it take to get that trailer set up so that you can basically be pretty much wherever you want and have the ability to live. What was that setup like?
Well, that's part of the competent man in some ways. I have no formal training in being an electrician or a solar installer or anything, but I knew basically, because my passion, or one of my big passions, is racing motorcycles, and being in Canada isn't very conducive to riding motorcycles or to be training for 6 months of the year. I went to the States for 6 months, or basically my whole Canadian winter, so that I could continue racing and training and doing that. I'm also very passionate about traveling and putting myself into novel situations. So the idea that I have a home away from home, that I can basically live out that dream of being a part-time professional motorcycle racer, is amazing to me. And I was going to be doing a race in basically the middle of nowhere in California, and I knew that there's no power there. I don't want to be running a generator and spending money on fuel the whole time. All of these different pieces to that, different complexities to it, because I know that there are systems, let's say the solar system that I built, that have the ability to be quiet, and that you don't necessarily have to be buying fuel for continuously. So what I did is, I see a need that I have. I dive into it with both feet. I learn all that I can about building a solar setup, and I rounded up a bunch of parts and materials that I thought that were going to be the best, or suited to that application in the best way. And what I did is I built a solar setup for my RV that I have now, basically, because I have the luxury of being able to travel and work anywhere I have internet. I've now been basically not plugged into the power grid since December. So what would that be? For the last 8 months, I have not been plugged into the power grid for even a day. And I think I may have spent, let's say, being generous, $15 on gasoline for my generator, because I had to use it when we had a couple of rainy or cloudy, stormy days in succession. I love the idea of it, because you understand how much power you need, how much power it takes to actually run a fridge, run lights, run water heaters, all of these different things. Again, for me, it's just another application of my curiosity and how I like to learn. And the system that I built, I have the ability to tilt it 4 different ways to maximize the angle of incidence from the sun to make the panels run more efficiently. If you're in winter months and you need more output from your panels, you can almost triple the output just by cleaning them and pointing them to the right angle. But yeah, there's a million complexities as well to that type of system to really optimize it. But the ability to have quiet, abundant electricity that I can run my Starlink and my laptop and to have more power than I possibly need is, as well. Oddly enough, I explain it as quite a luxury.
Let's just get this in here, Tom. Maybe this will be our final question. I forgot to ask it earlier on. When it comes to understanding economics, the monetary system, the value of precious metals, things of this sort, what are some of maybe you could give me a list of some of your favorite resources, books, Substacks, maybe just books for starters, and why you value that particular resource?
As resources go in general, I think you need to read widely, because we have the access to more information today than we ever have, and not all of it is going to be quality information. And the only tool that you have to combat or to filter what is good and or bad is your own mind. I think, before you apply yourself to any of these topics that we've covered today, You need to build a good basis of how to think and how to value particular pieces of information. And that's why I again, read so widely and interview so many different people, is because we need to be able to triangulate where we are in the world, because no matter how smart any particular person might seem, they do not have all of the answers. And they might be off on their timing or whatever it's going to be. So one book that I love and that I've read many times and I've mentioned and given is called The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli. And it's really analyzing how you think and trying to provide a framework for better ways of thinking and really questioning everything, from analyzing not only, let's say, a failure that you might have had, but also analyzing success and why you were successful, and actually being just as focused on understanding why you were successful rather than why you failed. Because if you got lucky, you're not going to understand anything of value of why you may have gotten a particular play or idea right. And to me, it's just as valuable to be understanding exactly why you may have been successful instead of only analyzing why you might have failed. Kind of this idea of building, let's say, a mindset of the way that you think about the world. Another book that is super valuable to me, that I have consequently, some of my favorite people or favorite friends that I've made, they've all read this book and they identify it with it very much, as the book Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, and using that as really a manual for how you think about the world and how you apply yourself to the world. And then moving on to some of the most interesting books that I've read, let's say in the finance realm, America's Great Depression. I think it's always interesting to learn about big events through history, because history always does rhyme. That was written by Murray Rothbard. The World for Sale is all about commodities and how commodities get traded. That's a very interesting read by Javier Blas and Jack, I believe it's Farchi. Lords of Finance by Liaquat Ahmed, and The Fearful Rise of the Markets by John Authors. These are all, I mean, I could list, I'm sure, 100 books, but I think it comes back to just becoming a perpetual student and reading widely so that you can become the filter to what you think, which ideas you think have the most value in your life.
That's a great place to end, and we'll have to talk more. We didn't get into your motocross life and many other things as well, but Tom Bodrovics, really appreciate your time. If you'd like to follow Tom and his thoughts and his excellent interviewing, he of course is the host of Palisades Gold Radio. We'll have links to that and his own podcast, the Competent Man Podcast. So Tom, I'll give you the final thoughts here.
Well, Gabriel, I really appreciate getting to have this conversation. Our interactions through the years, we always throw some really interesting ideas back and forth and challenge each other. And I think that's ultimately what life is all about, is being curious, understanding how you learn, and applying that passion to as many different facets of your life and of life in general. Because, we do have a gift of being able to understand the world in as many different ways as possible and applying ourselves, hopefully for good, within that world. And I appreciate everybody listening, and hope to interact with the audience more.
Hey, thanks for listening. I could really use your help real quick. If you could share this episode with someone, engage with me, leave a review anywhere. This helps me to break the technocratic shadow banning that is happening with my brand. And of course, if you really want to escape the technocracy, go to escapethetechnocracy.com. Privacy tutorial series, books, newsletters, consulting, and of course, you can leave a donation. Thank you very much.